In this part of the tutorial we're going to animate the globe rotating and also the text orbiting around. Let's just hide the Extrude NURBS News Today object and disable it. We can come back to that later. Come to the beginning of our timeline. Let's just move forward. Select the sphere to clone onto. If we jump to the coordinates tab, we can animate our heading, which will make our sphere rotate around. The thing is, I think that it would look slightly better and a little bit, well, not after realism, but the Earth is slightly banked as it rotates, and this will give it a little bit more interesting. So if we just set our bank to 10, but now if we animate the heading, you can see that it turns as if the axis is still perfectly upright, which isn't the result we're after. It looks like a very skewed kind of rotation. So let's just undo those. This is quite a common problem. Now the easiest way to get around this is to parent the sphere to a null object. So let's hold Alt and click to add a null, rename the null sphere. If we now set the bank of the null to be 10, we can select our sphere, and when we animate the heading, it now rotates correctly. So let's rewind to the beginning, switch to our timeline, and with our sphere selected, let's add a key for our heading of 0. Jump to the end, let's set this to be 180. We don't want it spinning too fast. I think half a turn throughout the animation will be okay. We will need to make sure that our kind of globe looks okay at that point, that we're not stuck in the middle of the Pacific Ocean or something like that. But once we have our text and things animated, we can come back and adjust that quite easily. Okay, so we've set up the first piece of animation. It looks as if the sphere is actually spinning the wrong way, but I think that's just an optical illusion. If we jump to the top view, scrub through, you can tell by looking at the axes that it is rotating the way we want it to. Cool stuff. Okay, so let's come back to the main view. I'm going to just move forward to frame 10. Let's unhide our fracture top stories. Okay, so at this point, frame 10, I want it to kind of whiz in, and at frame 20, which is where our camera sort of slows down, I want the top stories to be in the correct position. So the first thing I'm going to do is to come to the circle null, and let's just adjust the heading of this so that the top stories is somewhere like so. Now we have that in place, we can come down to our spline effectors and we can animate the spline effector top. As you remember, the offset of the spline effector stories is linked to the top spline effector using Xpresso, so we only need to animate this one parameter and we can animate our text coming on and off. Although I've adjusted the circle spline that these words are attached to, I think in hindsight it's probably a good idea to have my spline effector set to an offset of 50, so it's kind of halfway between 0 and 100. We can take this parameter below 0 or above 100, but if we switch to an offset of 50 and come to our top view, you can see that the text is actually on the dead opposite side to where we want it to be. So let's select our circle null, press R for rotation. In fact, I'm going to come back to the front view and just do it scrubbing the heading parameter. Let's just pull this around like so. Okay, just take it back slightly, and I think we could probably just lift it up a little bit. Switch to the move tool and let's just raise this up so it's somewhere around there. As this is all based on the spline position, once we've animated these, we can just move our splines later to adjust the position if we're not happy with it. So that's all good. So let's come to our spline effector, and now if we scrub our offset, we can move behind and come around. Cool stuff. Okay, so at the very beginning, we start close to the globe and we pull out, and at frame 20 the camera kind of stops moving and slowly pulls back. So at frame 20 I think the text should be in a position where it's legible, but at the beginning here I don't think we should see it at all. So if we say start on frame 10, let's take our offset and let's move our text so that it's round there and it's kind of out of sight. Let's add a key here by control clicking on the small dot. Now let's jump forward to frame 20 and let's pull this back. So if we set this at 50, it's going to be dead in the center. I think that again we should keep this moving just as the camera is. If it came round and then was static and then whizzed off, it would kind of give it a dead sort of feeling. So let's just jump up a couple of percent to 52, add a key here. Now scrub across to the point where the camera starts to zoom out again, or pull back should I say, which is frame 55. And now we can just click down on the offset so the top stories moves across. It's 4%, add another key, and now let's move to the next key on the camera, which is 65. Again, another 10 frames forward, and this time pull our offset down so the top stories is out of sight. There we go. Okay, so let's add another key here. So if we just come back and have a quick look at this, you can see the top stories comes in, it kind of moves backwards here and then it zooms off again. So the animation is starting to take shape, but as you can see we've got a problem with the curves causing some backwards and forwards motion as before. We may as well fix this as we go, so let's select the spline effector top and switch to F-curve mode. If you just click F-curve mode, it will come to the previous selected item, but if you have an object selected and you press Control, when you switch to F-curve it will show you the F-curve for that previously selected object. I'm going to just pull this up so I can see the F-curve manager slightly more clearly, and let's choose frame selected. And as you can see we have a similar problem as we did with the camera, where the value kind of comes down and then goes back up, whereas we want this to be an almost kind of straight line between these 2 points. So first of all let's get rid of that ease out, and again at the end, and this is the crucial part. So select the first, or the second key should I say. Let's just select both of those keys, choose frame selected, okay, and just scale that down slightly. Now select the second key out of these two, and again let's just create a nice almost linear path between them. And if we just scrub, you can see it comes into view, and then as we slowly move back, top stories slowly moves across, and then at this point here it whizzes around. Okay, cool stuff. So let's come back to our key mode. The next thing that I'd like to do is to make it so that the text actually scales up as it comes round and then scales down as it whizzes off, just to give it a little bit more dynamism. And because we're using MoGraph, we can use another effector for this, and the effector that I'm going to use is the plane effector. If you're using a pre-release 11 version of Cinema 4D, I think it's pre-11, the plane effector doesn't exist. So what you can do is you can just use the shader effector, and if you use the shader effector without any texture in it, it will have the same effect. So the objects that we wish to affect with the plane effector are the fracture objects. I'd like to actually affect fracture, latest, sports and top and stories. So if we select all of these objects, then choose MoGraph plane effector, when we come back to these, you can see that it's added that plane effector into all of them. So we don't need to come and drag it into the list later. Although latest sports isn't actually visible or being animated yet, we're going to want the same effect for that, so we may as well use the same plane effector for all 4 fracture objects. I'm going to take my plane effector and take it to the bottom of the object manager. There is an order of execution in Cinema 4D. Often it doesn't get noticed, but sometimes you do have priority issues, and I like to kind of try to build my objects as things happen. For instance, if you had a spline where you had attached objects to, and then you had some effect happening to it, it really makes sense to have the spline before the object that's being attached to it, because the spline doesn't actually exist in the hierarchy until the object, in which case you sometimes get a lag of 1 frame and things don't happen quite as they should. So for this plane effector, I'm just going to call this text scale, I can spell, twist, I'm going to add a little bit of rotation to this as well. So with our plane effector selected, we can come to our layer browser and we can add this to our effectors list. Come back to the attributes. In the parameter, you can see that position is enabled and our top stories has been pushed up 100 on Y. Let's just disable that. Let's select scale, uniform scale, and choose -1 so that it scales the text so it becomes invisible. Obviously we want the text to be visible at the front, but when it comes round we want it to be kind of invisible at the back and then scale up. So the way to do that is to use fall off. So we switch to the fall off tab, choose linear. Okay, we still can't see what's happening. So what that means is that the linear fall off is in the wrong direction. If we just hide our sphere for a moment, you can see there's the fall off from our plane effector. Come to the top view and you can see that it's pointing, I think you'll find, the wrong way. So if we pull back, you can see our text actually becomes the correct scale when it's round the back. So the easiest way to solve that is to select our plane effector, go to the coordinates tab and just set the heading to 180. And you can see now as we drag, our text scales up. Let's come to the front view so we can see this happening. Okay, there you go. So it's not actually very clear that this is happening. We could do with the scale being more visible so that it takes longer and the letters scale up kind of slower. So the way to do that would be to just increase the size of the fall off. Okay, so let's select our plane effector, switch to the fall off tab and let's set this to something like 800. Okay, maybe that's a bit high, I'm not sure, but you can see that now our text doesn't actually reach full height. If we switch to F5 so we can see the front camera view and the top view, we can grab our plane effector and we can kind of pull it back. And you can see that as we do that, the fall off moves through that space and the text actually becomes the right size. I think if we just take it back around there, that should be good. And if we look at the camera view up here, as we scrub back, you can see it's starting to scale down. And you can see the effect taking place. And because it's such a huge long fall off, we can see the letters scaling there. If we just unhide our sphere, we can see that it's going to work quite well. So you can see the effect actually taking place. And as we move across and the text goes around, again you can see it all scale down. Cool stuff. So that seems to be working okay. As I said before, I'd like to add some kind of twist to the text as it comes on. So let's come back to the plane effector attributes and switch to the parameter tab. We have our scale enabled. Let's also enable rotation. And for rotation, I'm going to set the pitch to be 180. Now let's just scrub through and we should see the text twisting. And there we go. You can see it kind of twists as it comes on, slowly moves around, and then twists as it wipes off. So that's working pretty well. That was quite easy to set up. It's a good idea now to come up and just save incremental. And now we can animate the latest sports in a similar way. It already has the plane effector in its effectors list. So all the twisting and scaling should work. So we just need to adjust the offset of the words along the spline. To animate latest sports, it would be a good idea to be able to see it. So if we all double click on the, or single click even, on the traffic lights, so it unhides, we can now see our latest sports. I think that it would look pretty cool if it was coming in at the opposite angle. So we've kind of got top stories coming in from this way and latest sports coming in from this way. I'm just going to make it a little bit more dynamic and a bit more interesting. But before we adjust the rotation and position of our splines, let's come down and select our latest spline effector. Come to the effector tab and just scrub the offset to make sure it's the correct one. Yep. Okay, let's set the offset to 50 as we did before so that it's in the middle of its values. And again, when we come to the top, if we disable our plane effector for a moment, you can see that the text is round the wrong side. So it's this circle null 02 that we need to adjust. Come to the coordinates tab, switch to our camera view again, and let's scrub this so it comes around Okay, cool. It looks like it's pretty much in the right place anyway. We could always adjust the bank if we want to adjust that, but I'm going to leave that as it is. I think that that's set up okay. Right, so now we've done that, we can come to animating. As our top stories moves off, latest sports should come into the scene. So let's come to here, which is the key as our top stories moves off. Come to spline effect to latest. Let's just move the text so it's out of view. Somewhere around there, 90. Add a key. Move to this point in time where top stories has disappeared, and at this point bring in latest sports. And I think we should do the same thing so that it kind of comes in slightly to the left and carries on moving across. So let's set the offset at 52. I need to just scale the view slightly so I can see where my next set of camera keys are, which is here. Move across. Let's jump this down 4% as we did on the previous so that the animation all has some consistency. Cool stuff. At this point here, this is where our camera zooms right back and latest sports needs to whiz off out of sight. So let's just set that to 0, so it should be right at the very back of our sphere. There it is. Okay, add a key. If we just hit render now, we can still actually see it, but if we switch our plane effector on, hopefully it's disappeared from view. It has. At that point we can always disable or hide these objects so that if there is a small amount peeking out as it whizzes around and scales down, we can switch it off at that point and nothing will be visible. Okay, so you can see then from that quick scrub through that we have the same problem with our F-curves for latest sports. So let's select latest, control click to show our F-curve, and let's just come in and adjust these as we did before. We can just do this quite quickly now because I think you're pretty familiar with the way that this works. Frame selected. That's S for that, by the way. I normally have these icons in my timeline layout. I don't normally access the menu command, so which is why I'm not using the keyboard shortcut, but perhaps I should start pressing S to frame the active or the selected. Keyboard shortcuts are a much quicker way of working. As I said, I normally keep the icons in the timeline, so I'm not working with my regular layout, but it's a slightly smaller area that we're using for capture. Okay, that's cool, that looks good. So, frame all, and let's just check this out. Cool stuff. So that's looking pretty good. I'm quite pleased with that so far. Let's rewind to the beginning. Let's press play. In comes top stories. Keeps moving. Don't forget this isn't playing back real time either, so although that may seem a little bit slow, once it's playing back the correct speed, you'll probably find that's fast enough. If we actually click in this menu here and on the edge of the timeline, you can see that at the moment it's set for all frames project. We can uncheck all frames and you can see that it will play much more like real time, but it just means that it skips some of the frames. Now, depending on what you're doing, you can't always skip frames. If you're working with thinking particles, it's not a good idea to jump frames. So that's why mine kind of defaults to all frames. But this does give us a more realistic overview of the kind of tempo of the animation. So that's a good little menu to know about. And you can always just come in there and change that on the fly. Okay, cool stuff. So we've done that. I think what we could do now is we could add some secondary animation on the rotation of the sphere so that as the text kind of whips around, so the sphere spins in a speedy way. I think that the two kind of items turning would definitely add a lot of interest. So I'm just going to save that, and then we can crack on and add the animation to the sphere. And what we're going to do there is we're going to use animation layers and add it as a secondary form of animation on top of the rotation that we already have. Let's just switch to the layer browser, and we don't really need to see our effectors at the moment. So on this layer, the effectors layer, we can just click here to hide them in Manager. That just cleans up the object manager a little bit, and as we get more and more objects in the scene, you'll find that these kind of things are useful just to make working a little bit easier. If we select the sphere and And we know already down here that we have the sphere to clone onto. We've added some rotation keys from 0 to 180. Now what I'd like to do is, as these objects twist around, I'd like to add some twist or some rotation into the globe as well. You might think, where has the animation gone that we just did on the effectors? Well, because I've hidden the effectors from managers, it hides them from the timeline too. If I click here, you can see that they appear back in the timeline. So the animation hasn't disappeared, it's just actually being hidden at the moment. I'm going to hide that anyway, because we can use our camera keys as a guide for when the rotation occurs, and we've also got the visual clue from the actual editor view. One thing I'm just going to do before we continue actually is let's unhide the effectors. Let's come to our plane effector. We've got that set up now, so if we switch to attributes, fall off, we can uncheck visible. We've got this kind of fall off visible in the editor, and it just makes everything a little bit more cluttered, so let's just switch that off for the moment. And let's move to frame 10. Come back to the layer browser and hide the effectors again. Select my sphere to clone onto. So at the moment we have this rotation that's already here. If I add a key here, for coordinates we're at 1.715, and then move forward I could add another key, and we're going to end up with quite a complicated little F-curve with lots of keys. However, I'd like to keep this rotation 0 to 180. In fact, what I'd like to do is keep this as a linear motion. I think if we fold this down and unfold the mini F-curve, we can see that we actually have an ease going on here. I think that the globe should just continually turn without slowing down and speeding up. So first of all, let's just select those keys and come to key and choose linear. And you can see that that just makes that a dead straight line. So our sphere just rotates continually without any interpolation on the speed. So if I want to add in some secondary animation to that, the way that we could do that is we can use what's called animation layers. To add the animation layer with the object selected, choose animation, add animation layer. And you can see the first thing that happens is we have a tag added to our object. If we select that tag, we have a motion system tag, and we've got a series of buttons, and here we have our layer 0 and default layer. With layer 0 ticked, let's hit rename, and let's call this extra rotation, and you can see that renames it. It's a good idea to kind of rename your animation layers as you go, so you can see what kind of animation they refer to. You can see here in the timeline that the sphere to clone onto no longer has any animation. If we tick the default layer, you can see the original rotation returns. So depending on which layer is ticked, kind of determines which animation is visible in the timeline. We also have a strength slider, so we can add some extra rotation, and if we think it's too strong, we can adjust this slider to kind of reduce it. So we could set some extra rotation on here, and we could actually animate this parameter so that that secondary animation gradually disappears. But for now, let's not get too complicated. Let's just move to frame 10, where we know the text starts to whiz around. And with our sphere, let's come to the Coordinates tab, and here we can add a key for our heading. Let's move to the frame 20, and let's add, say, +1. Excuse me, I've done that wrong. Let's move to the end of the field, +150, and then add a key. And you can see that down here we have 2 extra keys for the rotation. And as we move across, you can see that the sphere animates very quickly at that point. So now let's move to frame 55. Again, add a key for our heading, jump forward 10 to 65, and let's add 150 again, +150, and add another key. Okay. So that all seems to be working. Lastly, let's come to frame 100, add another key, jump to 110, let's add 150, and keyframe the heading once again. So now we have some secondary rotation going on, as we have all the other kind of dynamic camera moves and the text moving on. Once we have the shader effector clearly visible, that will become more apparent. If we come back to the motion system tag, which is actually here, on the earlier versions you'd have to check your actual tag, and we can switch back to our default layer and we can see that we still have our original animation. We have our extra rotation. If I kind of take the strength, you can see that as I take that back, none of that extra rotation is showing up. And if I drag the strength, then our extra rotation becomes apparent again. Let's select the word rotation, hold control and just check out our F-curve, and you can see again we've got a similar problem to before. If we roll over these values, you can see that they're the same. So we can select all of these values and we can choose from the key menu 0 angle, and that flattens those keys out. So now we have the extra rotation, but we don't have the sort of drifting of the values. So that's a kind of brief introduction to animation layers. We could always add another layer in there and add some scale or some position movement and things like that. But hopefully that will give you an idea of some of the things you can do. For now, we're going to leave that and come back to our main project. One thing that I do want to make sure of is when we're at a point like this that we actually do have a decent looking continent behind us. And at the moment, if we come to top stories, as we move across, we tend to have quite a lot of the Pacific Ocean here, and the United States, etc., is all over to the right hand side. So we've added the rotation to our sphere. So how do we kind of rotate this back so that it's clearly visible? The way that we can do that, because it's based on the shader effector, is we can actually adjust the shader or the texture that's being used. Now the texture tag that we're using is currently set to use UVW mapping as the projection type. Because this is a sphere and it's a parametric object, we can't actually adjust the UVs on the object without making it editable, and we don't really need to do that because as it's a sphere it's going to use spherical mapping. So the thing is, if we switch to coordinates and try and adjust the heading of our texture tag, you can see that nothing happens, and what we really want to do is rotate that around. So if we come back to our tag and choose spherical as the projection type, it still works exactly as before, but this time we can actually drag our heading and we can move this around. So if I just say set this to around 46, let's just scrub through and see what our world map looks like from the beginning of top stories. Okay. Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I think, to be honest, it could almost just be a little bit more central. There we go. Okay, so as we move around to latest sports, what I'm going to do is actually change the texture that we use so that this turns into a football. And so I'm not really interested in what the globe looks like at that point, it's only where top stories is. Okay, so we've changed that and that looks pretty good. Let's just press play and have a look at the animation so far. And you can see now we have the texture tag selected that the secondary motion on the globe really does add a little bit more dynamism to the whole animation. Cool stuff, so it's all starting to take shape now. The next thing that we're going to do is move on to adding the football texture to the globe. To do that we need to kind of create the texture, so what I'm going to do is model a really basic model of a soccer ball, and then we're going to apply a texture to it, and we're going to then bake that texture into a spherical map so we can use it with our shader effector. So we're not actually going to use the model of the soccer ball at all, we're just going to use it as a method of creating a material. So let's come up and save the project and let's move on and start making the soccer ball.